The courtroom was hushed, the kind of silence that made every sound feel like an intrusion. The faint rustle of papers, the soft creak of the judge's chair, it all seemed amplified against the tension filling the room. A dozen people sat in the gallery, most of them smiling warmly at the young girl seated at the front, her feet dangling nervously above the floor. She was small for her age, barely 9, with wide brown eyes that seemed to hold worlds of emotion. Her curly hair framed her face like a halo, and though she had been told this was her day, the weight of it seemed to press down on her tiny shoulders. Beside her sat Sarah and Michael Dawson, a couple in their early 40s. Their hands were clasped tightly together, their fingers interwoven as though they were holding on to each other for dear life. This wasn't just a day for the little girl. It was a day for them, too, a culmination of years spent dreaming of a family. Sarah kept stealing glances at the girl, her expression a mix of love, hope, and a flicker of nervous anticipation. Michael, ever the steady one, gave the girl a small, reassuring smile whenever her gaze flicked upward toward him. The judge, an older man with a kind but authoritative presence, cleared his throat. His voice was deep and steady as he addressed the courtroom. "We are here today for the finalization of an adoption," he began, his eyes briefly scanning the papers before him. "A day like today is a special one, filled with joy and hope. It is the start of a new chapter, not just for this child, but for the family welcoming her with open arms." The words brought a collective exhale from the room. Even the court clerk, who had seen hundreds of these hearings, couldn't help but smile. Everything was proceeding as expected, smooth and seamless. After all, this was supposed to be a celebration, a happy ending to a difficult journey. But then, as the judge directed his next question to the young girl, everything shifted. "Now, sweetie," he said, his tone softening, "before we proceed, I'd like to hear from you. This is your chance to share anything you'd like to say about joining this family. Is there something on your mind?" The girl hesitated, her small hands gripping the armrests of her chair. Her eyes darted towards Sarah and Michael, then to the judge, and finally to the polished wooden floor beneath her feet. For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't speak at all. The judge, noticing her hesitation, leaned forward slightly, his kind expression encouraging her to take her time. Finally, she looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I say just one thing?" "Of course," the judge replied, leaning back with a gentle smile. "Anything you want." The girl's small body straightened, and she seemed to gather every ounce of courage she had. When she spoke, her voice was clear, though trembling slightly. One word left her lips, and it was enough to stop everyone in their tracks. "No." The air in the room seemed to vanish all at once. The judge froze, his pen pausing mid-air. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Michael's brows furrowed in confusion, his gaze darting between the girl and the judge. The gallery exchanged bewildered glances, the warmth of the moment evaporating as everyone tried to make sense of what had just happened. The judge recovered first, his expression shifting from surprise to calm professionalism. "I'm sorry, dear, could you clarify what you mean by no? Are you saying you don't want to go through with the adoption?" The girl shook her head, her curls bouncing slightly, but her lips pressed together as if she were afraid to say more. The judge's gaze softened, but there was a new edge to his voice now, an undertone of concern. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe here. You can tell me anything." The girl glanced at Sarah and Michael again, and her eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth, closed it, then finally blurted out a single, trembling sentence. "There's something bad happening." The tension in the room snapped tight like a coiled spring. The judge straightened in his seat, his demeanor suddenly serious. "What do you mean, something bad?" he asked, his voice steady but urgent now. "Can you tell us more?" Before the girl could respond, the courtroom door creaked open, and a bailiff stepped inside, looking puzzled. The interruption drew all eyes, but the judge's gaze remained fixed on the girl. "Sweetie," he said softly, "if there's something wrong, you need to tell me." The girl took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she clutched the chair's armrests. "I can't," she whispered. He said not to. The words sent a ripple of unease through the room. The judge exchanged a sharp glance with the bailiff, who nodded almost imperceptibly before stepping out again. The judge turned back to the girl, his expression a mix of compassion and alarm. "Who said not to?" he pressed, his voice calm but insistent. "You're safe here, I promise." The girl opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, the door swung open again, this time with force. The bailiff rushed back in, a phone pressed to his ear and a look of urgency etched across his face. Without hesitation, he strode up to the judge and leaned in to whisper something that caused the judge's eyes to widen. "I need everyone to remain seated. the judge announced, his voice firm and commanding now. "This hearing is temporarily adjourned." The room erupted into whispers and confused murmurs as the judge reached for the phone on his desk. He dialed quickly, and when he spoke again, his voice was grave. "This is Judge Harlan. I need immediate assistance at my courtroom. Send officers now." Sarah and Michael exchanged panicked glances, their earlier joy replaced with a growing sense of dread. The girl sat frozen in her chair, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. Whatever she had meant to say, whatever secret she held, had suddenly become far more serious than anyone could have imagined. And as the distant sound of sirens began to wail in the background, the room collectively held its breath, waiting for the truth to finally emerge. The murmurs in the courtroom faded into a tense, expectant silence as everyone processed what had just happened. Sarah gripped Michael's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white, her mind racing. This wasn't how the day was supposed to go. This was supposed to be the happiest moment of their lives, the beginning of a beautiful new chapter. Instead, they were caught in a storm of confusion and fear, with no idea where it had come from, or where it would lead. Michael leaned closer to his wife, his voice low and steady, though worry clouded his eyes. "Do you think something happened to her before she came to us?" Sarah didn't answer. Her throat felt tight, and her heart ached for the little girl sitting in front of them. She had always known there were pieces of the girl's story they didn't have, parts of her life before foster care that were locked away, too painful to talk about. But this, whatever this was, felt different. It felt immediate, dangerous even. Sarah glanced at the judge, who was now speaking in hushed tones to the bailiff. The little girl, Emma, sat motionless in her chair, her hands clutching the sides as though holding on for dear life. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't make a sound. Her eyes flicked around the room, as if searching for an escape or maybe trying to see who was watching her. When her gaze landed on Sarah, it lingered for just a moment before she quickly looked away. Sarah's heart shattered. Emma had always been so brave, so resilient despite everything she'd been through. To see her like this, scared and uncertain, was almost too much to bear. She wanted to pull Emma into her arms, to shield her from whatever was causing her so much pain. But something about the way Emma held herself stopped her. It was as though the little girl had built a wall around herself, and Sarah wasn't sure if she was allowed in right now. The sirens outside grew louder, closer. The sound made everyone in the room more restless, more on edge. The judge glanced toward the gallery, his stern expression silencing the whispers that had started up again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice firm but calm, "I need you to remain seated and quiet. This is a matter of safety and protocol." The weight of his words settled heavily over the room. Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together what had gone so terribly wrong. She looked at Emma again, her lips trembling as she fought to hold back her own tears. She wanted to say something, anything, to reassure her, but no words seemed right. Instead, she whispered Michael's name. "We have to do something," she said urgently, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's terrified. Look at her." Michael nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know," he said, his voice tight. "But we don't even know what's going on. We have to let them handle it." The courtroom door opened again, and 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside, their presence commanding immediate attention. They moved with purpose, scanning the room as though assessing the situation. One of them, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, approached the judge's bench while the other officer remained by the door, watching the room. The judge leaned in, speaking quietly to the officer, but his face gave away nothing. Whatever was being said, it only seemed to deepen the tension in the room. Sarah caught Michael's eye again, and this time she saw her own fear reflected back at her. Meanwhile, Emma sat frozen, her small frame seeming even smaller under the weight of the moment. Her gaze was fixed on the floor now, her hands still gripping the chair as though letting go would cause her to fall apart completely. The officer speaking to the judge turned her attention to Emma, her expression softening. She approached, slowly kneeling down so she was eye level with the girl. "Hi, sweetheart," the officer said gently, her voice warm and soothing. "My name's Officer Keller. I just want to make sure you're okay. Can you talk to me for a second?" Emma didn't respond. Her eyes darted toward the officer, then back to the floor. Her small body seemed to curl in on itself, as though trying to make herself invisible. "It's okay," Officer Keller continued, her tone patient and kind. "You're not in trouble, I promise. We just want to make sure you're safe." The words hung in the air, but Emma didn't move. Sarah couldn't stand it anymore. She leaned forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Emma, honey, it's okay," she said softly. "You can talk to her. We're here for you." For a moment, it seemed like Emma might respond. She looked up, her tear-streaked face turning towards Sarah. But then, just as quickly, she looked away again, her lips pressing tightly together. The officer nodded as if she understood. She stood slowly, glancing back at the judge. "Can we speak privately?" she asked quietly. The judge nodded. "Of course," he said. "We can use my chambers." Before anyone could react, Emma's voice broke through the tension. It was soft, barely audible, but it stopped everyone in their tracks. "He's watching," she whispered. The words sent a chill through the room. Sarah felt her breath catch, her heart pounding in her chest. She exchanged a panicked glance with Michael, who looked just as shaken. Officer Keller crouched down again, her expression serious but gentle. "Who's watching, sweetheart?" she asked. "Can you tell me?" Emma shook her head, her curls bouncing slightly. "I can't," she whispered. "He'll know." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, her concern deepening. She glanced at the judge again, then back at Emma. "You're safe here," she said firmly. "No one can hurt you, but we need to know what's going on so we can help." Emma didn't respond. Her small hands tightened on the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning white. Outside, the sirens grew louder, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. More officers arrived, their presence only adding to the growing sense of unease in the room. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She leaned forward, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Emma, please," she said, tears streaming down her face. "We love you. Whatever's going on, we can get through it together. Just tell us what's wrong." Emma's eyes flicked towards Sarah, and for a moment, it seemed like she might say something. But then she looked down again, her small shoulders shaking as she cried silently. Officer Keller stood, her expression grim. She exchanged a glance with the other officer, then spoke quietly to the judge. "We need to take her somewhere safe," she said. The judge nodded, his expression heavy. "Do what you need to do," he said. As the officers moved to escort Emma out of the room, Sarah felt a surge of panic. She stood, her voice desperate. "Wait, where are you taking her? What's going on?" Officer Keller turned to her, her expression kind but firm. "We just need to make sure she's safe," she said. "We'll keep you updated." And with that, they led Emma out of the courtroom, her small figure disappearing through the door. The room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Sarah sank back into her seat, her heart pounding. Michael put a comforting arm around her, but it did little to ease the fear coursing through her. Whatever was happening, it was far bigger and far more dangerous than any of them had realized. Sarah and Michael sat frozen in the courtroom, their thoughts spinning wildly as the door clicked shut behind Emma and the officers. The emptiness of the space, once filled with hopeful anticipation, now felt suffocating. Sarah gripped the edge of her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. She kept replaying Emma's whispered words. "He's watching." Who was she talking about? What could have possibly scared her so much that she couldn't even trust the people trying to protect her? The judge remained at his bench, speaking quietly with the bailiff. His steady demeanor had taken on a more urgent edge, his furrowed brow hinting at the gravity of the situation. The scattered conversations among the gallery had turned into a low buzz, filled with confusion and speculation. Michael turned to Sarah, his voice hushed but firm. "We have to find out what's going on. We can't just sit here." Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. "But how? They didn't tell us anything." "She's just gone." Her voice cracked, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, trying to keep herself together. "What if she doesn't come back? What if—" "Stop," Michael said gently but firmly, taking her hand in his. "She's going to be okay. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out. We're her parents now. We'll protect her." The word parents hung in the air, heavy with unspoken doubts. Were they even ready for that responsibility? Sarah's chest tightened. They had fought so hard to adopt Emma, to prove that they could give her the love and stability she deserved. But now, in the face of something far darker than they had anticipated, she felt utterly helpless. Across the room, a woman in the gallery stood, her voice cutting through the uneasy quiet. "Judge, what's going on? We all deserve to know if there's a danger here." The judge raised a hand to quiet the room, his voice calm but resolute. "Please remain seated. The situation is under control. For the safety and privacy of the child involved, I can't share details at this time." The explanation did little to calm anyone. The woman who had spoken sat down with a huff, muttering under her breath, and others in the room exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah noticed one man in the back row staring at the door Emma had been led through. He was older, with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes, and something about him made her stomach twist. He wasn't dressed like the other attendees. His jacket was slightly worn, his tie loosened as though he hadn't planned to be here today. Before Sarah could voice her thoughts, the man stood abruptly and walked out of the room without a word. She turned to Michael, who had noticed too. "Did you see him?" she whispered. "The way he was watching?" Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, something's not right." In the hallway outside the judge's chambers, Officer Keller knelt down beside Emma. The girl sat on a bench, a small frame trembling as she stared at her hands. Keller's partner, Officer Ramirez, stood nearby, his eyes scanning the corridor for any sign of trouble. The courthouse felt too quiet now, the usual hum of activity subdued by the weight of the situation. "Emma," Keller said softly, her voice steady and patient. "I know this is hard, but we need your help. If someone is hurting you or threatening you, you have to tell us. We can't protect you unless we know what's going on." Emma's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't look up. Her small fingers twisted the hem of her dress, her knuckles white with tension. "You can't stop him," she whispered. Keller's heart sank at the fear in Emma's voice. She exchanged a quick glance with Ramirez, whose frown deepened. "Who, Emma?" Keller pressed gently. "Who are you afraid of?" Emma finally looked up, her wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "He's everywhere," she said, her voice cracking. "He always knows. He told me if I said anything, he'd hurt them." Keller's stomach churned. "Hurt who, Emma? Sarah and Michael? Or someone else?" Emma shook her head rapidly, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Everyone," she whispered. "He'll hurt everyone." Keller took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She had dealt with scared kids before, but there was something different about Emma's fear, something deeper, more consuming. Ramirez stepped closer, his tone low and serious. "Emma, listen to me," he said. "We can keep you safe. No one can hurt you here, but you have to tell us who you're talking about." Emma's gaze darted to the end of the hallway, where shadows stretched long and dark in the dim light. Her breathing quickened, and she clutched Keller's arm with surprising strength. "He's here," she whispered urgently. "He's watching." Ramirez followed her gaze, his hand instinctively moving to the radio on his shoulder. He exchanged a tense look with Keller, who nodded slightly. They had to act fast. Back in the courtroom, the tension was reaching a boiling point. Sarah couldn't shake the image of the man who had left, his sharp gaze lingering in her mind. She leaned closer to Michael, her voice low. "We need to find out who he is." Michael hesitated, then nodded. "Stay there," he said, standing. "I'll see if I can figure anything out." Sarah grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading. "Be careful." He gave her a reassuring squeeze before slipping out of the room. As the door closed behind him, Sarah felt a wave of unease. She scanned the room again, her heart racing. What if this wasn't just about Emma? What if whatever had scared her was closer than any of them realized? In the hallway, Michael moved quickly, his eyes darting around for any sign of the man. The courthouse seemed eerily empty now, the distant sound of footsteps echoing in the corridors. As he turned a corner, he spotted the man near an exit, speaking urgently into a phone. Michael slowed, trying to stay out of sight, but he couldn't hear the conversation. The man's posture was tense, his free hand clenching and unclenching at his side. After a moment, he ended the call and slipped out the door, disappearing into the parking lot. Michael hesitated, torn between following him and returning to Sarah. But before he could decide, a voice behind him made him jump. "Sir, can I help you?" Michael turned to see another officer standing nearby, his expression worry. Michael forced a smile, his heart pounding. "No, I'm just looking for my wife. I should get back." The officer nodded but didn't move, his sharp eyes lingering on Michael as he walked away. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the officer's gaze felt too knowing, too suspicious. As he re-entered the courtroom, his mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. When he returned to Sarah's side, she looked up at him expectantly. "Did you see anything?" Michael shook his head, his voice low. "He left. I couldn't follow him, but there was something off about the way he was acting. Like he knew something we don't." Sarah's unease deepened. She looked toward the door where Emma had been taken, her heart aching with worry. Whatever was happening, it felt bigger than them, bigger than anything they had imagined when they first walked into the courthouse that morning. And as the seconds ticked by, the sense of danger only grew. The air in the courtroom felt heavier now, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Sarah couldn't stop fidgeting, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her seat. She glanced at the door Emma had disappeared through, wishing she could see past it, past all the walls keeping her from the little girl who had already stolen her heart. Her mind swirled with questions she couldn't answer. Who was Emma afraid of? What had she meant when she said, "He's watching"? And why did it feel like danger was creeping closer with every second? Michael sat stiffly beside her, his jaw tight as he stared at the far wall. He hadn't said much since he returned, but Sarah could see the tension radiating off him. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his, trying to draw some strength from the connection. He squeezed her hand gently but didn't look at her, his focus locked somewhere else, somewhere she couldn't follow. The judge finally stood, his expression stern as he addressed the remaining people in the room. "I understand this is an unusual situation," he said, his deep voice cutting through the uneasy silence. "I assure you we are taking every precaution to ensure the safety of all involved. Please remain seated until further notice." The announcement did little to ease the tension. A few people murmured in frustration, but no one dared to argue. Sarah could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as the judge stepped down from the bench and left the room, escorted by 2 officers. The door clicked shut behind him, and the quiet that followed was almost unbearable. Michael leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to figure out what's going on. We can't just sit here and wait." Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She glanced toward the courtroom doors, half expecting them to burst open at any moment. Every creak of the wood, every muffled sound from the hallway made her heart jump. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something big, something terrifying. Meanwhile, in the judge's chambers, Officer Keller and Officer Ramirez were still with Emma, their attempts to calm her proving fruitless. The girl sat on the edge of a chair, her small frame hunched forward, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress so tightly her knuckles were white. Her wide eyes darted around the room as if expecting someone, or something, to burst in at any moment. "Emma," Keller said gently, crouching down to her level. "You're safe here. I promise no one can hurt you, but we need you to help us." "Who are you talking about? Who's watching?" Emma shook her head again, her curls bouncing as tears streaked down her face. "I can't," she choked out. "Gail, no. He always knows." Keller exchanged a look with Ramirez, whose expression was grim. They had both dealt with scared kids before, but this was different. The sheer terror in Emma's voice, in her body language, was unlike anything they'd ever seen. Keller tried again, her tone calm and reassuring. "Sweetheart, no one can see you here," she said softly. "It's just us. We're here to protect you. You can trust us." Emma hesitated, her small hands trembling as she clutched her dress. For a moment, it looked like she might say something, but then her eyes widened, and she let out a strangled gasp, pointing toward the window. "He's here," she screamed, her voice high and panicked. "He's here." Keller spun around, her hand instinctively going to the weapon at her hip. The blinds over the window were drawn, but she pulled them back quickly, scanning the street below. It was empty, nothing but parked cars and a few passers-by who looked as ordinary as could be. But Emma's cries didn't stop, her small body shaking as she backed into a corner, her hands covering her face. "He's here," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "He's going to hurt everyone." Agent Clark hesitated, then nodded. "We have reason to believe he may have been in contact with her during her time in foster care. It's unclear to what extent, but the child's fear suggests he may have threatened her or someone she cares about." Keller's voice cut in, her concern evident. She kept saying, "He's watching." "She's terrified. If he's as dangerous as you're saying, we need to act now." Clark nodded. "We already have units securing the perimeter, but if he's as close as the child believes, we may be working against the clock." As if on cue, Emma let out a sudden, sharp cry from her corner of the room. The adults turned toward her, their focus snapping back to the terrified child. Emma's small frame trembled violently, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at the door. "He's here," she whispered hoarsely. "He's coming." The words sent a shiver down Clark's spine. He motioned to Ramirez, who immediately stepped out to radio the other officers. "We need to lock this place down completely," Clark ordered. "No one in or out without clearance." But even as Ramirez moved to act, a loud crash echoed through the courthouse, followed by the unmistakable sound of a commotion. Shouts erupted from the hallway, and the faint buzz of static from a radio suddenly turned frantic. Shots fired. A voice crackled through the radio. "All units to the east wing." The room froze for a split second before springing into action. Keller drew her weapon, moving to stand protectively in front of Emma, while Clark grabbed his own radio, barking orders to the units on the ground. The judge, pale but composed, stepped back, his eyes darting toward Emma. "Get her out of here," he said firmly. "Now." Keller nodded, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Emma, we're going to move quickly, okay? Stay close to me." Emma didn't respond, her small body rigid with fear. Keller gently but firmly took her hand, guiding her toward a side door that led to a secure hallway. Clark followed close behind, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow for signs of danger. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, the noise from the hallway had seeped into the space, setting everyone on edge. Sarah's grip on Michael's hand tightened as the muffled sounds of shouting and movement grew louder. She glanced toward the door, her heart pounding. "Something's happening," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded grimly, his eyes narrowing as he watched the officers stationed near the entrance. "Stay close to me," he said, his tone protective. Before Sarah could respond, the door to the courtroom burst open once again, and 2 officers entered, their expressions tense. "Everyone, remain calm and stay seated," one of them commanded. "We're evacuating this wing. Follow instructions carefully." Panic rippled through the gallery as people began standing, their voices rising in confusion and fear. The officers worked quickly to maintain order, guiding small groups toward the exits. Sarah and Michael stayed close, their hands tightly clasped as they moved with the crowd. But even as they followed the officers' instructions, Sarah's thoughts were consumed with Emma. Where was she? Was she safe? The thought of her being caught in the middle of whatever was happening made Sarah's chest tighten painfully. As they neared the hallway, another loud crash echoed through the building, followed by what sounded like footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too close. The officers immediately drew their weapons, motioning for the group to stop. "Get back," one of them shouted. "Stay behind us." The group froze, the air thick with tension. Sarah clung to Michael, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the sound of footsteps grew louder. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears, and she gripped Michael's arm tightly, her entire body trembling. And then, from somewhere in the shadows, a voice rang out, low, cold, and chillingly calm. "You can't hide her forever."